Welcome to this post on Viking archaeology, in which I talk to Professor Else Roesdahl about pagan beliefs and Viking-age graves. And thank you very much first for Else for joining us for this post. I'm sure many of you will know Else Roesdahl's famous book about the Vikings, which has been translated into many languages and has been in print for many years. And some may also be familiar with her work on the Viking ring fortresses from Fyrkat in 1977 and later on Agersborg a few years ago.
Together with you.
Yes. Elsa has trained a generation of Viking-age and medieval archaeologists and has been supervisor of many people. And you've been my supervisor as well for my PhD. But today we have agreed to talk about something different, namely Viking-age burials, which you started researching many years ago. And tell us, Elsa, how did you first come to study Viking-age graves?
It started many years ago when I was a student and I was working at the National Museum, and I was asked to make registrations of the finds from the Viking fortress of Fyrkat, and that included the burials. And that was fascinating because I unpacked, in fact, from paper bags and little boxes what had been found by excavations 10-15 years earlier. So it was sort of a second excavation, and there were 28 graves, and some of them were very interesting and some were very unusual. And among them were two so-called, so it turned out, wagon graves with women who had been buried in wagon bodies. The remains were very strange in that only rows of iron nails were preserved. And when it was excavated, the excavator in 1954, Sven Søndergaard, he was not a trained archaeologist. In fact, he identified these very strange coffins as wagon bodies.
So when you started out on that, only you and Sven Søndergaard knew about that fact?
Yes.
So what did you do to those then? This was a new discovery.
It was a new discovery, and on the basis of my student job, I made my thesis in history, and by then I was of course very curious about this strange burial custom, and I found out that there were in fact several older finds back in the 19th century which had the same features. So I discovered that it was in fact a burial custom, and all the burials where we could decide the sex of the dead person, it was always women. So I discovered a new burial custom for upper class women, and that I'm quite proud of. It's sort of a contribution to Viking women's studies.
Indeed. So at the time, what was the reaction? Were any other researchers onto similar thoughts, or what was the response?
Later, I got some grants to publish my findings and publish the cemetery from Fyrkat. And at the same time, Michael Müller-Wille, who was a young German scholar in Kiel, he was digging a burial in Germany next to the town of Hedeby, and he had the same peculiar features in his burial in his cemetery at Sindbæk, and we talked a lot about it, and it was very nice to have somebody who was really also interested.
So you had a new burial custom, and you started thinking about what were the implications.
Yeah, and then I started, of course, to look at the male burials also. And it was very clear that the equivalent of these rich female burials, that was riders' burials for men.
And what are they?
that they are very well equipped burials for men with horses and weapons and riding gear.
Yes.
So we had the women who were buried in one way and the men who were buried in a different way. And that had not been realized before. It was just until then seen as, rich burials.
And the fact that men and women were then buried both with transport equipment, nobody had actually seen that before. What did that make you think?
Yeah, at the time it was not fashionable to interpret anything along religious lines, because everybody knew that it was very, very dangerous, and the written sources on religion were late and so on. But on the other hand, there was at the time a very good interdisciplinary environment, and I knew a number of very good philologists and historians of religion, and I started to think, could it not be? And it was, and they taught me a lot, and I read a lot about it. At the time of these burials, there was, and particularly in Denmark, and particularly in the upper classes, there was a sort of fascination of Odin and Valhalla. And then I thought, if there are these concepts around the mid-10th century, and we have these graves by the mid-10th century, they must be linked together.
They
somehow.
must relate in some way.
They must relate.
So did that just reflect, did you think, the general beliefs of the Viking Age, or when did these graves occur?
They, it's a burial custom which springs up in the first half of the 11th century, of the 10th century. That is briefly before the introduction, before the formal acceptance of Christianity in Denmark, which is in the early 960s. So we have this extravagant burial custom for men and for women just decades before and during the period when Christianity was formally accepted in Denmark by Harald Bluetooth.
So you had these elaborate graves as something new that starts to come up and reflecting pagan beliefs just about the time when Christianity becomes a central issue in society.
And then one thing leads to the other, because then I also started to read about conversion periods in other countries. For example, in England, where it happened a couple of centuries before. But there we see the same features, that just before this official conversion, there's a rise in pagan materiality in burial customs and in other matters. So I thought, this must be the same thing here, and you can see it in a number of countries. It's reaction and counter-reaction. It's very, very simple in a way.
So around, I think it was 1983, you wrote a paper that brought these things together and suggested that, well, in the first place, these burials related to the beliefs about Valhalla, and also that this was then actually, although this was on the surface very pagan, that it had something to do with Christianity.
Yeah, a reaction.
A reaction. Yeah. And that idea, the pagan reaction to the Christianity, that's something that's been taken up quite widely by other researchers, isn't it? But when you wrote about that,
that it was totally new.
Yes.
And and it was fascinating for me, and then it also developed in the way that it seemed that before the formal acceptance of Christianity, there was not just this religious revival with Odin and Valhalla and so on, but there was also some sort of national revival with a revival of ancient types of monuments, which were sort of redefined, invented. You talk of social anthropologists use a concept invention of tradition in a new way, and then it's taken up again and thought to be something really Danish or whatever, and that is seen at the same time as these burial customs, and we see it in Jelling, for example, with the Danish royal burial mounds, and the two mounds in Jelling and the other features in Jelling. It's reinvention of traditional features. They're just much, much bigger and more splendid.
Yes, indeed. Now, you mentioned that you saw the wagon body burials and the riders' graves as reflecting beliefs in the afterlife. But we don't have any texts, of course, telling us about women traveling to Valhalla in a wagon. What do we know about women's, their beliefs and their afterlife?
They didn't go to Valhalla because Valhalla, that was for men. It was for fierce warriors who spent their free time fighting, and then they went back to Valhalla, the big hall, to eat and drink. And this burial custom for women shows that they must have had something equivalent, but we do not know what it was. There's a vague reference to Freya's hall, and it may be that they went to Freya's hall. They didn't spend afterlife with their husbands, but it may be that they went to Freya's hall. And I suppose that the reason why it's not mentioned in the written sources, which are of course later than the Viking Age, is that these histories, they are written by men, and they were not particularly concerned about women. They were interested in warriors. And they were written by Christian men, so it became even worse. So I believe the women were left out because the histories were written by Christian men.
So this discovery actually also led on to the realization that there was a whole area of, well, a gender and a whole area probably of belief that the sources have not informed us on.
Yeah, and that happens in very many areas, but it's of course very important to realize it.
But you have also told me that there was one of these graves which you sometimes call your special friend.
yeah. One of the graves at the Fyrkat cemetery was very unusual. The grave, it was a wagon body, and the grave goods was very varied and comprised objects not known from anywhere. And the excavator, Sven Søndergaard, was puzzled by it. So was I, and till this day there are several of the pieces of grave goods to where we can't find any parallel. But it points east, also to somewhere, Russia, the Orient, or something. There were all sorts of really unusual things there, including henbane seeds. And henbane, if you fire it and you sniff it, it's like
creates hallucinogen.
Yeah, something.
Visions.
It's a means of getting contact with the other world. Yeah. And at the time when I wrote, published,
book.
Yeah, you had to be very sort of down to earth and not say too much. But thank God it's better now. And a number of years ago, a younger colleague of mine and good friend, Neil Price, who's now in Stockholm, he suggested, and wrote a big book, he suggested that the woman in Fyrkat and other graves, which reminded, where the grave goods reminded him of it, that it was so-called vulva graves, sorceresses, which did as a pagan pagan female sorceresses which provided links to the other world by way of magic. And this woman, she also had, by the way, a little charm, a chair-shaped object, which is thought to be a symbol of Odin. So the woman in the wagon body at Fyrkat, she was probably a sorceress, a pagan sorceress, and she was buried with all these pagan grave goods at the fortress of a Christian king. And that is very interesting, I think, because it also shows that and there were several other pagan-style graves at that cemetery. It shows that the king, Harald Bluetooth, who introduced formal Christianity in Denmark, made it official that he must have been a clever politician because he must have been very tolerant with regard to religion, allowing really a pagan sorceress.
Yes. So the statements about paganism in the graves were actually very closely entangled with Christianity at all levels.
The fortress it's pretty well dated, as you know, and was built in Christian times, perhaps 10 years after the formal introduction of Christianity in Denmark. But the cemetery, some graves were probably Christian. There were children's graves which belonged to Christian times. There was no ditch around it. The cemetery, which is a Christian feature, so that was not there. There were pagan features in some graves. There was a very peculiar feature, a big platform, which is not known from anywhere else. So it was really a cemetery where you had mixed beliefs.
Yes. So, and if you had just gone with the official history of the age, of course, you would never consider that there could have been a pagan side to a royal monument at that time.
No.
So it shows us that we need we need archaeologists to think out of the box.
And we must look at the things. We must look at the evidence, and not go with the mainstream always.
Yeah, or with assumptions.
Yeah.
Well, Elsa, thank you very much for sharing this fascinating story with us. I hope perhaps you will return another time and that you will return for more posts on Viking archaeology.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.